Hey, welcome back to Slow Bells. Today I'm in Michigan City, Indiana. The trip that I've been doing down the southern half of the Lake Michigan shoreline has been a pretty slow trip, and there's a couple reasons for that. For one thing, they've been doing work on the locks in the Illinois River, which is still ahead of me. I don't know, 3 or 4 days maybe. So it doesn't make any sense to get down there in a hurry because they won't let you go through the locks. So I am dawdling as I slowly get closer and closer to the Illinois River and those locks. The locks should open up pretty quick though, so that restriction is rapidly going to go away pretty soon. The other reason I've been kind of dawdling is that it's nice to wait until it's a nice, fairly calm day on Lake Michigan for me to do my traveling. My boat doesn't seem to like Lake Michigan when Lake Michigan is in one of its bumpy moods. But Michigan City is only about 5 hours away from Chicago for me, so once I get moving again, the next stop should be Chicago. But to show you a little of what the southern half of the eastern shore of Lake Michigan has been like, that is what I'm going to show you now. Check it out. First of all, I forgot to mention in my last video that while I was in the boatyard having my transmission repaired, I had to say farewell to my shipmate Bob, who had been with me for 6 weeks. Personally, I don't see how anyone could put up with me that long, but somehow Bob did it. It was time for Bob to return home to Atlanta and resume work on his own trawler. As for me, I would be cruising Slow Bells solo until I picked up my next shipmate somewhere southwest of Chicago. I arrived in Ludington, Michigan on a Saturday morning. It was a beautiful late summer day, but there was wind in the forecast and I did not think it wise to press my luck any further. I anchored in an outrageously deep anchorage, which was 30 feet deep, and demanded that I use all of my 200 feet of anchor line. But it was a well-protected anchorage and would keep me safe from the wind and rain in the forecast. By Monday, I was getting low on both fuel and food, so I motored a mile or so to the Ludington Municipal Marina for one night. They took care of my fuel problem, and a small grocery store in town took care of my need for more groceries. This is the biggest badger I have ever seen. It's a coal-fired ferry boat that runs back and forth across Lake Michigan in the summertime. There isn't a lot of room for this big ship to maneuver into its slip in Ludington, so the captain has an interesting docking technique. As he approaches the dock, he drops his anchor. This helps the captain not only stop the ship, but the ship swings around the anchor so the stern of the ship is positioned properly as he backs into the dock. I can't wait to try this maneuver out with Slow Bells the next time I try to dock in a marina where there is little room to maneuver. There is typically a pretty good crowd on shore who will show up in the evening to watch the badgers return, similar to the tradition of watching sunsets in Key West. I planned to head out of town Tuesday morning, but I heard the wind kicking up at times during the night. By morning, the wind had died down, but the waves had not. And worst of all, the waves were mostly on my beam, causing my boat to rock like a drunken sailor. This box on my upper deck, which contains tools and building supplies, weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 pounds. It is held in place by 2 black straps. Lake Michigan was not very impressed by my 2 black straps, and I suddenly found that the box had broken free of its bondage, and all 200 pounds began merrily roller skating around my upper deck as the boat rolled back and forth. After 10 miles of abuse from Lake Michigan's beam seas, I decided not to tempt fate any further. Although my original destination had been Muskegon, I aborted that mission and ran to the protection of Pentwater Lake instead. Thank goodness for all the little hiding places along Lake Michigan's eastern shoreline. Pentwater Lake was delightfully calm. But the first two anchorages I checked out suffered from the same deep anchorage syndrome as the one in Ludington. I then checked out another anchoring area in the southwestern portion of the lake, and it was also 30 to 35 feet deep. But a little further out in the lake from this third anchoring area, there was a small area with only 20-foot depths. I anchored in that 20-foot spot and settled in for several days of waiting until Lake Michigan gave me permission to scamper a little further south again. Like most smartphone users, the apps I choose to have on my smartphone tend to change over time. I switched my anchor alarm app to a new app called My Anchor Watch. One of the cool things about this app is that it draws a little picture over time, showing how my boat is moving relative to the anchor. I currently use the free version of this app, but you can upgrade to a paid version of the app that has no advertising. I also replaced the free version of my Windy app for a paid version of an app called Windfinder. The thing I like about the paid version of Windfinder is that it will give me buoy reports. For example, if I wanted to see what the winds were doing in northern Lake Michigan, I could select this buoy, White Shoal Light. The report tab would show me the recent wind history. It also has two tabs you can select for future wind forecasting. Each of these tabs uses a different computer model to predict future winds. There are many apps available for both wind and anchoring, and everybody gets to choose which one they like the best. After 4 nights at anchor in Pentwater Lake, the wind settled down on Saturday, so I headed out into Lake Michigan once again. Similar to the previous Tuesday morning, the wind had died down and was blowing from a more favorable northerly direction, but the waves were still pretty enthusiastic and rolling in from more of a westerly direction. Since I was headed south, this put the waves on my beam once again, and Slow Bells was rolling like crazy. Fortunately, I had a brand new piece of gear on my 200-pound toolbox on the upper deck. I called it a Lake Michigan anti-roller skating device. It worked like a charm. The rolling motion of my boat was at best uncomfortable and at worst potentially dangerous. The seas were 2 to 4 feet high, with the occasional 5-footer thrown in for good measure. I could not point Slow Bells where she needed to go, but I decided to approach the problem using more of a sailing mentality. Let me explain. A sailboat cannot sail directly into the wind. If you try that, the sails just flap around like a flag on a flagpole. But the sailboat can sail at roughly a 45-degree angle to the wind. If you do this for a while on port tack and then switch over to starboard tack for a while, you can eventually sail upwind in sort of a zigzag pattern. In the case of Slow Bells, she could not motor along with the waves on her beam, but she could motor along with the waves striking her starboard bow, similar to a sailboat on a close reach. Slow Bells could also motor along with the waves on her starboard quarter, similar to a sailboat on a broad reach. I found that by doing this zigzag sort of course, I could make slow progress towards the south. So that's what I did. Over time, the wind and waves and coastline allowed me to take the waves from pretty much dead astern. This actually gave me a boost in speed. At one point, my normal 7.5 knot speed hit a maximum of 11.4 knots as my 22,000-pound trawler surfed down one of those 5-foot swells. Fortunately, after Lake Michigan got tired of beating me up for an hour or two, it allowed the wave height to diminish, and I had a relatively good afternoon following the coastline further south. I initially didn't plan to go very far that day, but as conditions improved, I decided to go a little further. As a result, I ended up passing by several perfectly good hiding spots and ending my day around 6:30 in the evening at anchor in Holland, Michigan, roughly a 67-mile day. I stayed at anchor 2 nights to let some rain pass through, then spent a third night at a marina in Holland. Finding a marina in Holland was a little challenging. The first 2 marinas I called said their transient slips were all full for the rest of the season. I suspect that had something to do with the big haul-out rush that happens every fall as the Lake Michigan boaters put their boats on dry land for the winter freeze-up. The third marina I called had an answering machine and never returned my call. I was finally able to get a one-night slip at Elding's shipyard, but it was a long distance to where most of the Holland stores were located. While I was in Holland, I learned that one of the Illinois River locks that they were working on was experiencing some high water due to local rain, and that would delay the reopening of the lock. So it looked like there was no big rush to get to Chicago. In theory, I was now a day away from reaching Chicago, but the trip from Holland directly to Chicago would be a long one out in the middle of Lake Michigan. I wanted to cut down on that overall distance quite a bit before I left the protection of land and headed out into that big bad lake in search of Chicago. From Holland, I moved down the coast just a little bit to Saugatuck. Once you pass through the Saugatuck Jetty, you wind through a small river for a little while until you get to a lake with the town of Saugatuck on the north side and the town of Douglas on the south side. There were nice homes all around the little lake where I anchored. I ended up hanging out in Saugatuck for almost a week, mostly at anchor. My generator suffered from indigestion one morning after sucking in too much lakeweed, and the water pump impeller did not greatly benefit from the experience either. Fortunately, both of these problems could be remedied with a little work. Toward the end of my stay in Saugatuck, my buddy Tom showed up on his trawler, Carib. I had met Tom the previous year on my cruise to Lake Champlain. Tom and Carib were now on their second Great Loop trip. Carib and Slow Bells finally left Saugatuck on a beautiful Tuesday morning and headed down to St. Joseph, Michigan. That grassy area just to the right of the railroad swing bridge is a free city bulkhead where we tied up for a few nights. The Free City Bulkhead where we stayed is a great place to tie up for a few days, except if you've got a strong west wind. In this picture, you are looking west from the St. Joseph City Bulkhead where we tied up. Just to the right of the railroad swing bridge, you can see the open water of Lake Michigan. With a strong west wind, those big Lake Michigan waves roll right past the jetty, past the railroad swing bridge, and slam right into any boat that is unlucky enough to be tied up to the free bulkhead. But if the wind is right, this is a great place to stay. A short walk from the Free City Bulkhead is Silver Beach. It's a nice sandy beach, a little dance hall with a merry-go-round, and more sculptures per acre than any park I had visited in quite a while. Do you realize what this is? It's a large Lafarge barge. Later, I watched this monster return to Lake Michigan. He did it by backing up, believe it or not. He had to thread the needle through the narrow railroad swing bridge opening, and he did it in pitch darkness. The front of the barge had a big-ass bow thruster. On Thursday morning, slow bells followed Carib down the coastline to Michigan City, Indiana. Wow, a new state and a new time zone. Tom anchored for the night and headed toward Chicago the next morning. I grabbed a slip at the municipal marina and hung out in Michigan City for a while, waiting for better weather. Chicago was now about a 5-hour cruise across the bottom of Lake Michigan. I don't know if you can tell all that well on this video, but it's kind of a poopy day out there. We had a thunderstorm overnight and looks like steady rain for much of today, and the winds are going to kick up, I think, this afternoon and blow the next several days. So I am in Michigan City for a while. The next video should be the short hop to Chicago and then the trip through downtown Chicago and down the Illinois River towards the mighty Mississippi. I'm looking forward to that. Hope you can join me then. Later.